From growing up in a harsh region of Georgia to becoming one of the most powerful men in the Soviet Empire, Lavrentiy Beria was a faithful reflection of the rigor and hardness of the Russian gentility. His story is also the story of the Soviet Union as its own leader and as Stalin's right hand for most of his term before, during, and after the Second World War. Ensuring the stability of the state at all costs was his motto. Skillful, cold, austere, and excellent manager, the Iberian Brenta was the favorite instrument of the great machine that the states became in the 20th century. Also a pioneer of Russia's future nuclear development, his life was marked by intrigue, political intelligence, and the violence inherent in the power game that always marked the Soviet peak, of which many Russians are still proud. Let's get to know the life of Stalin's strongman, about whom many myths have been created. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the new encyclopedia, and I invite you to like this video, leave your comments, activate the bell, and support us on Patreon, which you can find below, so we can continue to bring you exclusive and quality content. Lavrenti Iberia was born in a village in Abkhazia, which today is de facto an independent republic in dispute located in the country of Georgia. The region of Georgia at that time was part of the Russian Empire. He was born on March 31st, 1899 at the dawn of the new century. His parents were farmers and were not ethnically Russian, but Georgian. They belonged to the Georgian Orthodox Church, and his mother was particularly devout. In 1907, he sold part of his house to study at the technical school in Sukhumi. He graduated in 1915 at the age of 16 and went to the city of Baku, which is now part of Azerbaijan but was then part of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was a hotbed of revolutionary movements, from liberals to communists, all aiming to end the Romanov dynasty, one of the last standing Christian monarchies and empires in the world, a dynasty that had already had to make several concessions to these movements. In the February Revolution of 1917, Tsar Nicholas Romanov abdicated the throne and a provisional government was established in Russia. Then, in the October Revolution of that same year, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and established what would later become the Soviet regime. Studying outstandingly at a Polytechnic School of Mechanics in Baku in 1917, this is when Beria claims that he supposedly entered the Bolshevik and Menshevik circles, quickly standing out in them. However, when Lenin and Trotsky's Red Army took the city of Baku in 1920, Beria was accused of having worked in the security services of the Musavatist Party, which was an anti-Bolshevik party that ruled Azerbaijan. When the Tsarist Empire falls, the so-called Democratic Republic of Azerbaijan is established, the first democratic and secular republic of the Muslim world ruled by the Musavatists, but this falls with the arrival of the Soviets 3 years later. Beria was sentenced to execution but was saved by procedural issues. Also, some claim that he served in the Red Army but had deserted. Due to the alleged intervention of the plenipotentiary, Soviet in the Caucasus, Sergei Kirov, Beria is released and returns to Baku to continue studying. The Caucasus refers to the region of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Now, already known in political circles, Beria ends up opting for political life and assumes as an executive of the Communist Party to be a vassal, and also joins as secretary of a section of the Cheka in Baku. The Cheka was the first political police created by the Bolsheviks, which marks his start in the rise of Soviet politics. He quickly stands out for his intelligence and organization and becomes very close to Miryafar Bagirov, who ruled the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan for 20 years during Stalin's mandate. Georgia in 1921 was still under the control of the Mensheviks, but after a Bolshevik revolt, the Red Army conquered Georgia and established the Soviet Republic of Georgia. Lavrentiy Beria was chosen to be sent to the capital of Georgia to organize the new political police of that region and to put an end to the numerous armed gangs that existed. There he meets the woman he would marry, Lina Gegechkori. In December of 1922, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia would be reunified as the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, although they would be separated again by 1936. After his success in ending the armed bands in Georgia that same year, in 1922, Beria returns to Azerbaijan now as vice president of the Cheka of that region and begins as in charge of secret operations. Russia was coming from a bloody civil war, and within Moscow there were strong disputes to consolidate power. The skillful coldness of Beria would have the opportunity to manifest itself during the nationalist uprising of Georgia in 1924. It was a violent era where people were willing to kill or die for a cause. Beria was in charge of suppressing this nationalist uprising, ending it in just 3 days, and after which allegedly between 5,000 to 10,000 people were executed. A year earlier, he had also dismantled the Armenian Revolutionary Federation in record time. These operations began to earn him many praises from the party and awarded him the Order of the Red Banner. During this time, he personally met his fellow Georgian Joseph Stalin and became one of his allies in his rise to power after Lenin's death. Beria continues to gain ground, ending bandit groups, internal dissent, and religious uprisings in the Caucasus against the Soviet regime, also dismantling the intelligence networks of Iran and Turkey, as well as penetrating their governments with spies. Beria gets promoted in 1929 as president of the Unified Political Board of all Transcaucasia, being in charge of all police and security operations in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, key territory for the Soviet Union. After a few brief years of economic liberalization in the Soviet Union, Stalin reapplies in 1928 a policy of expropriation and centralization of lands in all socialist republics, which produced social and economic unrest, which was also taken advantage of by internal dissidents like Trotsky to use armed bands and the discontented people against the Bolsheviks, with Beria being the one who had to face these uprisings again with total success. But he who had dedicated himself more to the police than to politics demonstrated his cunning for the latter after earning by force, after many internal disputes, the position of First Secretary of the Communist Party of Georgia and Vice Secretary of Transcaucasia. During his tenure as head of the Caucasus, the region achieved excellent agricultural and industrial performance, innovating in oil exploitation and agriculture. In addition to his political and police skills, Beria had extensive technical knowledge. During his 7 years as head of Transcaucasia, it is said that he maintained a frugal life different from the rest of the leaders. By 1934, he was elected member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, thus finally reaching the innate cream of Soviet leadership. During this period, he moved from Georgia to make a life in the big leagues of Russian politics in Moscow, although he continued to exercise direct control over Georgia until his death. All of this was possible due to his skills and gradually earning the trust of the leader Joseph Stalin. By 1935, he was already one of his most devoted collaborators. The Soviet regime continued to be the target of numerous intrigues and internal and external enemies, from Trotskyists and anarchists to nationalists and foreign agents. By 1934, Sergei Kirov, one of the most prominent members of the Soviet nomenclature, is assassinated. This event served as a catalyst for the process known as the Great Stalinist Purge, or the Yezhov era between 1934 and the late 30s, called the Yezhov era because of Nikolai Yezhov. Was Stalin's man who executed this broad policy of trials, executions, and imprisonments of tens of thousands of low and high-ranking dissidents, serving as the director of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the famous People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs by its Russian acronym Stalin's police apparatus and the supervisory body of state security. Lavrentiy Beria, fully aligned with Stalinism, was in charge of carrying out this purge in his region of Transcaucasia. Once internal peace was consolidated, Nikolai Yezhov, who was the main executor of this purification process, also had his turn in 1938. The People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs had acquired excessive power. and it also had to be purified now. And Stalin's trusted man for this task was none other than his Georgian compatriot Lavrentiy Beria. Yezhov was dismissed from his post, and Beria became the new head of the Internal Commissariat. Although Beria is often associated with Stalin's so-called period of terror, he was rather appointed to that position to stop and bring order to a purge process that had acquired massive dimensions. During Beria's tenure, tens of thousands of people were released and certain levels of excesses and injustices were officially admitted. Thus, a strict internal surveillance was maintained, but now with more limited and small-scale actions. Beria immediately initiates an internal purge of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, displacing most of the organization's officers. Nikolai Yezhov, his family, and many other officers were arrested, tried on charges of foreign espionage, charges of excesses in the purges, and finally executed. A few weeks after Beria's appointment in 1938, the Central Committee of the party and the Council of Ministers established a decree marking a new policy that ordered an end to mass persecutions. Surveillance and repression continued, but on a smaller scale, now focused on the war that was to come and that Stalin was predicting. In this way, Beria went from being a son of farmers from an inhospitable region of the Caucasus to being at the top of the powerful Soviet Empire, consolidating himself as the head of Stalin's National Security Police. After Russia's unsuccessful attempt in 1939 to form an alliance with England and France to attack Nazi Germany, they opt to form a treaty with Nazi Germany that results in the invasion and annexation of segments of Poland by both powers. This was one of the preludes to the Great War that was to come. With the advent of World War II, called the Great Patriotic War by the Russians, and with internal peace already consolidated in the Soviet Union, Beria's state security actions focused on the repression and deportation of nationals from Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia identified as enemies during the Soviet occupation of these countries. The Katyn massacre is particularly mourned in Poland, in which a plan presented by Beria to Stalin was executed. Around 22,000 Polish prisoners, including military, police, and civilians opposed to the Soviet regime. In June of 1941, Nazi Germany troops enter Soviet territory after tensions between both powers intensified. Beria is appointed General Commissar of State Security, the highest rank within the Soviet police. Beria was a key piece in directing Soviet efforts to defeat the Axis powers. Beria did not skimp on the use of hundreds of thousands of People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs prisoners as labor for armament production, hand in hand with Georgy Malenkov, whose alliance would be very important later in this story. He also did not hesitate to harshly punish any hint of defeatism or desertion from the troops. Likewise, he created a network of agents destined to spy in territories occupied by Nazi Germany, even managing to infiltrate the governments of Germany, Japan, and other Western European governments. In 1942, Beria conducted another major purge of the Red Army and similar industries in order to suppress any element that hindered war efforts. Beria was later accused by his enemies of having raped dozens of women during this period. However, his son and wife, until their last days, long after Beria's death, vehemently defended these allegations as false in defense of their father's innocence. Being one of the high-ranking Red leaders with the most industrial and technical knowledge, Beria also took over the supervision of the Soviet nuclear project, which sought, among other things, to create weapons of alleged mass destruction through nuclear energy, which was a theoretical possibility, not consummated in practice. But the truth is that Beria was a key man in the future nuclear development of Russia. For this, he relied on information provided by a double agent who was working on that same nuclear project in the United States, which demonstrated Beria's great abilities to obtain key intelligence from all powers. Finally, in 1945, the Soviet Union, in friendship with England and the United States, defeat the nationalist and fascist forces of Europe, divide the continent, and thus end up consolidating the power of Stalin and his entourage in an almost absolute way. Beria was in charge of deporting thousands of foreigners from Chechnya, Crimea, the Germans of the Volga, and other countries accused of having collaborated with Russia's enemies. Simultaneously, Beria met with a man named Kim Il-sung, recommending to Stalin that he support him to install a communist regime in North Korea. Today, the Kim dynasty continues to rule. Georgy Zhukov was one of the Russian generals who gained great popularity during these times for his great victories during World War II. So Beria, under Stalin's instruction, carried out a maneuver to discredit and accuse Zhukov of being a Bonapartist and send him to irrelevant military posts on the Soviet periphery. Zhukov thus became a fierce enemy of both, and very soon, as you will see later in the video, he would have the opportunity to take revenge. Beria was also in charge of the establishment of the secret police in the new Soviet republics of Eastern Europe, appointing as directors trusted men he handpicked. In the post-war peace years, with a 70-year-old Stalin, the internal struggles in Russia to impose themselves as heirs to the throne became part of everyday life. To outside eyes, Russia was a stable nation and continued to become an industrial power, but within the Soviet cliques, the competition was tough. Andrei Zhdanov, leader of Leningrad, was one of the favorites to succeed Stalin. Simultaneously, Beria leaves his position as head of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which he had brought to its peak as one of the world's largest intelligence networks, to move on to other more important tasks in peacetime. The new People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs turned into the Ministry for State Security successor to the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti, carried out several operations against Beria's arrivals as part of these internal struggles for the succession of the throne. One of them was the dismantling of the anti-fascist Jewish committee that Beria himself had formed years ago. Likewise, many of those appointed by Beria to prominent positions in the Soviet republics were Jews who were accused of Zionism and rootless cosmopolitanism, condemning and executing them for destabilization and for sending weapons to Israel. Similar repressions were carried out in Poland, in other Soviet republics, and against Jewish intellectuals within Russia, with campaigns that covertly accused Jews of conspiring against the stability of the regime. This showed a shift in Bolshevik policy that initially had a large Jewish component. In the midst of all this, Beria remained a strong man of the regime and had an ally in Georgy Malenkov, another strong man of Stalin. Fortunately for him, his rival Andrei Stanov died in 1948, and following this, Beria carried out a purge against the supporters of the recently deceased, executing hundreds of his close associates, including high-ranking officers. It is here that the figure of Nikita Khrushchev emerges as an alternative to the Beria-Malenkov duo. Finally, the expected but still surprising ended up happening. The most powerful leader of communism worldwide died on March 5, 1953. The organization of Joseph Stalin's funeral was secondary to the fast-paced political game that had just begun to see who would take command. Malenkov, an ally of Beria, manages to be appointed as the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union and also established himself as the party leader. However, after a week, Malenkov had to resign from the party secretaryship, and Khrushchev took over this position, which marked the beginning of a sort of doomvirato. In the midst of this, Beria manages to be appointed as the Deputy Prime Minister and reassigned as the head of the MBD, the old NBKD that he had led for so many years and was about to become the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti. There was a tough struggle within the Kremlin, and Malenkov, virtually the most powerful man, did not show the necessary leadership skills. There were those who perceived that he would end up being a puppet of Lavrenti Beria, who had already made many enemies during his time as Stalin's right-hand man. After Stalin, Beria was undoubtedly still the man with the most ability and statesman skills, but political alliances were not on his side. Beria takes a turn and proposes to the Politburo a liberalizing and more technocratic policy in politics and economics, similar to the thaw that Khrushchev would later carry out. But as the famous phrase dictates, the revolution devours its own children. Nikita Khrushchev manages to get more Soviet leaders on his side and launches a narrative that the liberalizing policy should have a foreign origin and would only lead to destabilization, relying on the strong protests that erupted in Berlin months after Stalin's death. The position against Beria begins to coalesce, and Malenkov, the presumed loyal ally of Beria, ends up switching sides. The accounts of Beria's fall vary. Nikita Khrushchev relies on the members of the Politburo and General Georgy Zhukov, the former war hero persecuted by Beria and Stalin, to imprison Beria on alleged charges of illegal activities against the state and the party. His main men were also captured, and the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs forces were disarmed, all in the style of the lightning purges that Beria himself used to carry out. In a trial without defense or right to appeal, Beria and 6 of his closest men were sentenced to death, ending the life of one of the most important men in the Soviet Union with a gunshot. Another version from his son says that Beria was never at the trial and that he was actually murdered at his home as soon as the decision was made to neutralize him. Beria's powerful intelligence network was reduced to the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, and the Soviet leadership made sure that no police chief would ever have as much power as Beria had at his peak. 2 years later, Malenkov was forced to resign as prime minister, and it was Nikita Khrushchev who took over the leadership of the Russian Communist Empire for at least 6 years, in which he advanced several liberal reforms and the process known as de-Stalinization. Thus ended the life of Lavrentiy Beria, who lived until his last day in the bowels of the power game, from which he never rested since he decided in that city of Azerbaijan to join the Bolshevik ranks. Cunning, cold, and very organized, his figure fell into the shadow fought between official and unofficial history. Victim of his own methods, Beria was a favorite instrument of the relentless great machine that states have become in the 20th century, with the Soviet Union being a faithful example of these political apparatuses that know no lukewarmness, that sweep everything aside to achieve their glory and fulfill their will.